Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. If you are in this Zoom, you are at Queering HSIs, leveraging policy unapologetically to advance racial equity for LGBTQ plus community college students. My name is Dr. Ricky Gutierrez. I am your moderator for this session. Just a few housekeeping before I introduce our presenters. I have a few items to share with you. Please note that we are in a Zoom meeting and that you have full access to your video and audio microphone capabilities. Please be mindful of the presenters and other attendees in this session and stay on mute or mute yourself when not actively asking a question or sharing when prompted by the presenters. Should you have questions or comments otherwise, please enter them into the chat box. As time allows, we will share your questions with the presenters and they may monitor as well. Additionally, you may use the chat feature to share thoughts with the presenters and or with each other. The session listing in the conference app details the session and includes any documents provided by the presenter. The app also includes a short survey at the end of the listing. We ask that you complete the survey at the end of the session as it is important feedback for planning purposes. Thank you for being with us and enjoy the session. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Our first presenter is Dr. Angel Gonzalez, who is a first-generation queer Joto Latinx scholar from Los Angeles. His work is focused on examining the conditions, experiences, and outcomes for minoritized students with a focus on queer and trans Latinx AO community college students. His comunidad are driving forces behind his research and practice, serving as a board member for Seattle's Latinx AO LGBTQ plus organization, Entre Hermanos. Our second presenter is Yolanda Cataño, is a doctoral candidate in the San Diego University EDD Community College Leadership Program. Her passion for HSIs is infused in the work that she does in and outside of academic spaces, such as serving as a board member for the Imperial Valley LGBT Center. Yolanda serves as the Interim Associate Dean of Institutional Effectiveness, Equity, and Student Success at Imperial Valley College. Everybody do that clap-in emoji and welcome our presenters. The mic and stage is yours.
Gracias so much, Dr. Gutierrez. Thank you so much for having us here today and being in shared space. I'm going to go ahead and share our screen here. So let me know if you see that. Perfect. So again, Angel Gonzalez, pronoun him, he, they, ella.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. My name is Yolanda Cataño. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. And just welcome this morning.
Thank you for being here today to learn a little bit more about our work and just an opportunity to really position a lot of policy state mandates as a way to advance this work for our comunidades. But to start off, we wanted to take a moment to recognize the land in which we reside and from which we're coming to you all. It's important to recognize this as we inhabit the unceded territories of Indigenous people. I, at the University of Southern California, I am in the lands in the presence of the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga peoples. And Yolanda is in the Imperial Valley at Imperial Valley College that occupies the Kumeyaay people and Tongva Nations people's lands. This recognition and naming is a beginning step to reconcile the historical genocide and continuous displacement of Indigenous communities that have allowed for our institutions to exist today. Let us sit in the discomfort and reflect on our commitments needed to do the work towards liberation and justice. To learn more, you can visit native-land.ca to look at which are the Indigenous territories in which your institutions reside and where you live, and opportunities for you to engage in learning about our Indigenous communities that are still very much present in our communities. Within this realm, we also want to recognize the constant oppressions that enacted upon us and how they're all interconnected, right? It is not for us to mention kind of what Bambi was saying, what's going on in the Supreme Court as it pertains to the Roe versus Wade case, right? the ongoing legislative measures towards eradicating and erasing queer and trans peoples and youth across states legislature with 198 plus bills across the nation, gag orders against race, critical race theory, and then now, right, the control of people who birth and their bodies. I think whenever we engage in collective space of self-exploration of our identities, it is important to recognize that these experiences are not silo or exist disconnected from other social political realities. All oppression is connected, and when one suffers, we all suffer. So really posit this quote from Audre Lorde that reminds us that there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, right? So this work is really important for us to do, and also name how we enter it and how we're existing, right? Because in this reality of what's happening, you all still garner the energy and strength to be here today together. We appreciate that. We're going to transition over now to a little bit about us and how we enter this work, and naming our positionality. Again, Angel Gonzalez here, this is my familia. This is our acceptance to San Diego State University for our doctoral degree. And I say ours because everything that I do is in a collective matter. I grew up in Southeast Los Angeles, in Southgate, Bell Garden, South Central. And in this community's witness and experience the ways that systemic inequities embedded across schooling manifests towards in access to education, right? So those experiences have really shaped why I want to move towards advancing access to education. In addition, having the intersecting identities of being somebody who's first generation, a queer Latinx Joto, coming from the hood, those experiences have shaped the lens in which I do this work in the context of community colleges. And why community colleges? Because for me, the students there are students who are thirsty for success and really taking the second chance, third chance, fourth chance, right, at changing their livelihoods. And these students are not in the abstract for me. These students represent my sister. So my little sister is in community college trying to continue her transfer degree attainment. And then my older sister got her AA at community college at East Los Angeles Community Colleges, ELAC in the house. As she was a teen mom and had to step out of high school and then come back and finish her GED and continue her AA. So for me, it was really important to position myself as a resource, as an access points to students who need it the most. Because when we talk about college students, the majority of college students are enrolled within the community college system. I'll pass it over to my colega.
Thank you, Angel. And just like Angel shared, we share a lot of commonalities and similarities with our upbringings. I will state just quickly about some of my major points in my upbringing. As you can see, this is my own familia in the same way that Angel, we position everything that we do from our personal experiences. I was born and raised in Mexicali, Baja California, Mexico. So for me, having that border experience, that binational experience, that language experience, for a lack of a better word, really had an impact on my upbringing. That multiplicity of identities that I hold, in terms of being queer and being bi, and that being at the forefront as a salient identity really helped catapult what it was of being in the work. In addition, I will share from a personal experience that a lot of this positionality is through also having a sibling that went through gender identity issues and tried to commit suicide at the age of 17. So when we talk about these experiences, my experiences personally and having a sibling that has gone through, such an impactful experience really impacted my own academic journey, why I'm so invested in the work, and where we think how that comes about, especially in our communities, from our Latinidad, from our perspectives of like that Mexican culture and how we exist within these positions. Really makes a difference, and how we show up and how we represent in these spaces, particularly in the community colleges. In my role as administrator at Imperial Valley College really has also shaped that visibility and awareness that I have in terms of my ability to move forward a lot of these initiatives and implementation of budget and resource allocation for our LGBTQ communities. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Angel.
Gracias, Yolanda. And that piece, right, that you mentioned around our work, right? So we've been, or our community college administrators, I have worked in the community college system, both in California and then the state of Washington. And our experiences in leadership have really been driving forces, as probably as some of you are here, is to seeing how there's a lack of of policies and structures to support queer and trans students in the community college. Some exist within the four-year context, but then when we think about the community college, they're kind of not even there at all, right? So which is why spaces like these are so important, and what drove us to our own research and our dissertation, but our broader research agendas. So for the purpose of today, here's an overview. We're going to go over the objectives that we have, the equity issue at hand, the theoretical frameworks we utilize to kind of push forward what needs to be done as it pertains to policy implementation, and then some implications for policy and practice. And there'll be opportunity for y'all as audience members to engage briefly too. So again, we really want to have you all be able to walk away or log off knowing serving as within the context of Hispanic serving institution community colleges, but then how we also conceptualize it through this critical lens of servingness, including queer and trans Latinx individuals. And then also gain some strategies to advance racial equity work for LGBTQ community college students. These were the two sessions and objectives we really gathered for today. As we know, right, we have a very small time together that we recognize that even attaining to some of these might be a difficult task, but we're hoping that we're able to do it in the next 40 minutes that we have together. We also wanted to offer a quick overview of terminology, as we know that maybe some of you are not familiar with it or maybe haven't had access to it in different matters. So Hispanic Serving Institution, HSI, is an institution that's designated by the Department of Education who meets 25% or above Hispanic student enrollment or also low income, right? So they have this designation if the student population of the institution is 25% or above Hispanic, Latinx, or low income students, then they get this designation. In addition, they have the opportunity then to apply to funds, right, and grants such as Title III and Title V monies that are directly tied to certain initiatives to support that growing student demographic population at their institution. Title III as it pertains to STEM initiatives, and then Title V broader like initiatives to support student success. Again, we have the term Hispanic, that was used and adopted within the US Census during the Nixon administration. And we only reference it when like certain documents or the research we're citing references as Hispanic, as we know it's not a identity term that's inclusive and encompassing of the diversity within our own Latinx AO diaspora. Latinx is a term that we use to really center the notion that Spanish language is a binary language that often erases trans and non-binary individuals. So when we have the X, it really disrupts and serves as a linguistic disruption to cause pause, right? It's really intentional in causing a pause for us to think, why is it that is it this way? And how does then having this binary understanding of our cultural like understandings influence how our queer and trans and non-binary side folk are erased or perhaps forgotten, and how we carry out the work that we do. And Latinx was really a term coined within activists in Latin America. So a lot of folks have seen it made its way into the mainstream of higher education in the US, but it's actually a term that started in South America with a lot of transvestite activists who utilize it as a way to disrupt linguistics again. LGBTQ plus, we use it as an umbrella term to capture, right, the community often, it's like kind of the acronym to capture the broad identities of our community within the sexuality and queer spectrum. Is not by any means meant to be a all comprehensive end all be all, right? Because we understand that there's also nuances within understanding sexuality and gender identity and not having to complain both or of the other. And then we use queer as a political identity, a kind of reclaimed word to really posit this huge umbrella of what does it mean to be part of this broader community. And again, this is a term that was utilized prior as a derogatory term and then taken back during the civil rights movements and the LGBTQ rights movements of the time to really reclaim a sense of self and reclaim that word. So now we see it often used. Older generations of our community might not feel as comfortable using it because for them, they really suffer the repercussions of having this term used against them. So again, brief overview, not exhaustive list, but just wanted to give it to you as we might use some of these words in our presentation.
Thank you, Angel. And just to note again, everything that Angel said. So based off of all of this terminology, when we came into the doctorate program, Angel and I met and talked about, this paucity of research. And we kept noticing that in the framework of Hispanic serving institutions, there was just this focus on that racialized lens, right? And so we were thinking about decolonization and the work that Dr. Gina Garcia in particular had put together at the forefront of, disrupting from a racialized lens. We thought, there has to be, a space where we put at the forefront the LGBTQIA identity. And so we decided to take it upon us, to bring that, and reconceptualize what we thought servingness meant by disrupting the H in Hispanic. And what that importance of prioritizing the LGBTQIA identity would mean in terms of disrupting that white supremacy lens within the multi-conceptual framework that positioned Hispanic serving institutions and the servingness piece. Next slide. So why California? So one of the things that we note is that we have a large Latinx, Latino, Latino population. And so we have about 39.4% of the population that identifies as this group. And there's 176 HSIs in California. 95 of them, so 54% of them are 2-year public institutions. So when we think about why this is important, we think about the LGBTQ plus summit, this is why it's important. We have a large population of our students. For example, at Imperial Valley College, we have over 90% of students that self-identify as Latinx, Hispanic. So when we think about how we utilize the work at, our community colleges is really, really important. And when we think about the multiplicity of identities that students hold is why we're making sure that we're putting at the forefront. As it pertains to Hispanic serving institutions, Excelencia in Education recently provided a report that identified that HSIs as a whole, were decreasing. However, emerging HSIs were on an increase. So there has been also a flux in between the number of HSIs. However, California remains consistent in the amount of, HSIs and the enrollment of Latinxes overall. In the entire California community college system, we serve about 2.1 million students, and then 44.54% being Latinx. And this is coming directly from the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office data mart. Next slide. So in the current landscape, one of the things that we have noted that is really, really important. So we think about policy, we think of the Latin landscape that we have in terms of like how we service our students. We think about how we position data as part of the evidence piece in connection to the language of evidence, right? So we think about recently, it's not until recently that the CCC Apply and the California Community College Application Portal and the CCC, the California Community College's Chancellor's Office recently back in fall 2018 decided to start collecting data on the gender non-binary category. Based off of that, we've now have more students identifying beyond the binaries of male and female. So based off of that, we have now robust data that can support the disproportionately impacted students. And we now have a way to say there is a need. And so that is our current landscape. And we're figuring out ways now that the California community college systems are being intentional about utilizing funds. And we'll talk a little bit later about what those funds are. But so we contextualize that this is just beginning, right, in terms of that evidence piece. And now how do we move forward as institutions and taking that accountability and responsibility for serving our LGBTQ plus students? Next slide. In addition to all of the things that we have to do at the community college and our commitments, we think about our vision for success, right? And we have our 5-year goals and our commitments. We have a lot of high expectations. A lot of those evidence-based decisions really come from, the impact on initiatives, policies, et cetera. And we are responsible for adhering to all of these in the increase of enrollment. And we know that enrollment is on the decline because of the pandemic. So a lot of these things have now been at the forefront of like how we position ourselves, how we understand the characteristics of our students, how we provide partnerships? How do we become innovative and create that action piece for implementation strategies to support our students and our more disproportionately student populations? Next slide. And then how do we align those resources for programs, programming and support of our students? So I love this slide because it allows you to see kind of the visual of like where we are, you know, the why, the what, and the how, and the tools. So we have a very difficult job, right? As you can see, we have, you know, guided pathways, we have the vision for success, but in addition, we have the system level support, but also mandates that we have to adhere from everything from AB 705 to California Promise. We're going to be talking about later about the Student Equity and Achievement Program, the Student Center Funding Formula, and the Vision Resource Center professional development that could yield, you know, more of these resources for our constituents and stakeholders to learn more about LGBTQ communities. But as you can see, it's a lot that we're tackling within the California Community Colleges system and looking at how do we put the students first. And so we wanted to know that this is how the Chancellor's Office is envisioning us, putting the responsibility and accountability on us, and then how we are interpreting the work and positioning all of the work to center LGBTQ plus voices. We also want to note that in addition to the programs and services and support that we got from the Chancellor's Office and the initiatives that have put the student needs first, we also identify the resources and centers that have come up. This is great, great work. And I know that this is not the entire list, that we know that there's other Pride centers coming around the corner for all of us. And this has been, you know, at least even in the findings of my own dissertation, I have found that the Pride Center has, you know, been a source of safety for the students. It has been, you know, like a home away from home. So the more that we yield these centers and resources for our students, it's really great to see the work that some of these community colleges are doing. And we just wanted to say thank you for the work that you're doing and to continue to grow and position these centers at the forefront.
Can I add something real quick?
Sure, sure.
I think also with the centers, right, it's important to recognize that like often the system utilizes this as a checkpoint of we're doing something, right? But centers don't necessarily translate into material resources. So it could be a person, it could be a part-time counselor doing advising for a student organization, and they call it a center. But really, there's no way to see which one is a robust space with pro staff, with budget, and like institutional support, right? Those are the pieces that are important when we think about structural pieces to change to support the queer and trans students. So this is great, and it also makes us wonder, like, well, what is a center in the eyes of who, right? Because again, it could be someone who has, you know, again, their part-time gig, and then they're the advisor, and then the college utilizes that as we're doing queer and trans student support stuff. So I think that I wanted to note that real quick.
And also I will add that, you know, based off of, you know, what Angel just said, I also want to note that the heavy work that, you know, community colleges do, it's really hard for even for us to get, you know, the Pride centers even, you know, created. We have, you know, very minimal resources being able to be allocated to specific subset of population. So when we think about producing evidence, going back to that piece that I mentioned about 2018, this is the first time where we're gathering information from 2018 now, where we say, yes, there's evidence that we need to serve LGBTQ plus communities. And out of this, now we have more Pride centers at the forefront. How we go about now then increasing not just awareness, visibility, but resource allocation for our students, this is where it starts. And I just want to note that that's probably also the difference between universities and the important work that community colleges are doing. So I also want to know and just thank the efforts of those that are working at the centers. In terms of HSIs, we have about $124 million in appropriation for HSI grant funds. So Ankit spoke a little bit about Title III title funds. This is what we have shown in the Department of Education so this is a lot of money that has been, you know, placed in the entire system for community college, for HSIs. And if you think about the impact of this funding throughout the nation, and remember going back to the slide about there's 176 HSIs and 95 of them are community colleges. There's a large portion in the millions of dollars coming into our community colleges. What are we doing to serve our Latinx, Latino, Latinx students and our LGBTQ plus students? Next slide. And then we also are talking about our Student Equity and Achievement Funds. So now we have this funding source that has been also at the forefront of many of our discussions. And when we were doing this research, we were looking about how the program via the Ed Code was doing in connection to the Guided Pathways program to support the students to eliminate those achievement gaps. So we have about $451 million. For example, alone at IVC, we have over $2 million. And so now we're looking about how we're going to not just spend the money, but we're looking at what we're going to do, how we're going to intentionally impact our students, identifying what the student populations are in order to provide better services to decrease those achievement gaps, and looking again how these strategically align with all of the initiatives. So I just want to know the money matters, right? Funding matters. Where we put our money, our intentionality, our efforts really is important for us to support our students. Next slide. And these are the resources for our LGBTQ plus students. We're thinking about that $10 million one-time funding that was allocated. So recently, we discovered with Assembly Bill 132 that we got one-time funding in the amount of $10 million that is distributed to all community colleges. So we have about $15,000 that have been distributed to each community college. And now that one-time funding, we're like scrambling to think about where we're going to do, what we're going to do with that one-time funding. So again, going back to that evidence, now we have, funding. What are we going to do? Thinking about the Pride Centers, thinking about what professional development could look like for our community colleges, who needs to be at the table. We're thinking about the allies that are joining us today. We're thinking about all of you stakeholders, the students that are partaking in this. We really need to make sure that our voices are heard, that all of the stakeholders take responsibility and state, what are we going to do with this funding? What are going to be the objectives? What are the outcomes for that one-time funding? What is going to be the intentionality for those outcomes beyond the lavender graduation ceremony, beyond a center, beyond student services? What are we doing to impact the lives of our students that are specific to our LGBTQ plus student populations? This is heavy, and this is a great success for our community colleges and for our LGBTQ plus populations. Next slide. Ankit.
Yes. So thank you so much, Alana, right, for breaking down those different monies that we have, right? And again, these are the buckets. We know that the way that they're distributed is dependent by campus and student enrollment and all these other components that impact how the money gets distributed. But nonetheless, we wanted to give you a snapshot, right, of the money is there and how do we align the work that we're doing in a sense of urgency that's aligned with, okay, the system is telling us to prioritize this vision, to close disproportionate equity gaps for disproportionately impacted students. And now we have these one-time monies. So what we did is we examined this different flows of money in a way that reminds us of data speaks. So we utilize the servingness framework understanding to kind of, okay, for HSIs in particular, looking at community colleges who are HSI, which is again over 50%, how is it being expanded beyond the racial ethnic piece of identity for Latinx AO students? And we do that by intersecting it through a queer theory lens and utilizing critical policy analysis. So here's a framework really quickly, a multi-conceptual framework that suggests that structure of serving should account for validating and racialized experiences within institutions. However, it doesn't explicitly call out cis heterogenderism or cis heteropatriarchy or cis heteronormativity. So that's for us where queer theory comes into play, right? Is we understand that within servingness, right, there's these pieces around the racialized experiences of students who fall within the racial ethnic categorization of Latinx, Latina, Latino. However, our students don't exist in a silo, right? We exist at the intersections of our identities. And often these programs and services and supports are only looking to support one element of a student identity, thus prohibiting them perhaps from still fully feeling supported or belonging at the institution, as is not accounting for other pieces of self. So when we think about queer theory and then critical policy analysis, for queer theory, it allows us to think about and offer the lens of transforming dominant structures, as the queer theory lies in the framing of queer as a site of becoming or constant questioning of norms. So when we think about servingness and constant questioning who is being served, right? constantly questioning the policies. Well, why isn't this being manifested towards the student demographic? It allows them to, in that interrogation, begin thinking about opportunities to leverage it towards a certain student population that is often forgotten or erased, right? And it has to do going back to the lack of data piece. And however, that cannot be a scapegoat. It's like, okay, yes, there's a lack of data and that needs to change. But also you have these monies that you're telling us is specifically to support equity efforts, racial equity efforts, and now specifically LGBTQI efforts. So no, there can be a like, well, we don't know it. It's like, no, we have some monies. If we think about it and consider it through this critical policy analysis lens, that talks about how then those leaders who carry out the policy are policy actors, it provides an opportunity for us to interpret policy in a way that will be beneficial for the students who have been constantly erased in the narrative, right? So here's a better way to put it. We have these money buckets, right? From HSI Title III, we have the Student Equity Achievement Program and the money from Assembly Bill 132, which I call queer and trans money, making money moves. So when we add this up, we're talking about like, $500 million in some capacity. Again, how it gets shaken out to individual institutions will look different, but what we wanted to bring note and bring attention to is there's a lot of money and yet there's not a lot of resources. So there's definitely a disconnect from where the money is coming from to the implementation, to the manifestation of the resources and services for the students who need it most, right? Because literature tells us that queer and trans students, in particular queer and trans students of color, experience higher levels of distress due to dual identity navigation that they have to do of being queer and or trans and of color. So navigating not only racism and hostile climates in that space, but also cis-heterogenderism and cis-heteronormativity at their institutions. So they're often like in this both and. So the monies is there for us to start thinking about what is it that we're gonna do, right? And I think this is really one of the big pieces of our presentation is how do in your institutions, you begin to align efforts in a way that advocate to, hey, we also need some of that money to do this really intentional work. Because we know that the LGBTQ Assembly Bill 132 QT money is a one-time fund. And what happens when that's done? Is initiative done? Okay, but our students are not done. Our students will continue to be there. So it has to be integrated, or it has to be intersectional with other streams of money to be able to support and institutionalize the efforts for the students. So what we wanted to do here is we wanted to ask you all, what would be some comprehensive strategies, right? If you're thinking about that number of that I mentioned, the pot of money, I'm gonna put this Padlet link in the chat. And if we, I'm hoping that you all can see it, but we want to ask you all to participate and really consider what is your bold and unapologetic vision for your representation and existence at your campuses. So I think you're able to just add a little, on the bottom right, there's a little plus sign of the Padlet, and you can add your own thing there and answer like, what would this look like, right? What services, what curriculum, right? Think about it from wherever your standpoint is. If you're a student, what would you want to see? What would communicate to you of I exist and I'm represented here? If you're a professional staff member or a faculty member or a leader, what are you for yourself too? What would that communicate for your institution that they value me as an employee who has these intersecting identities, right? So I want to take the next five minutes just here for you all to consider this question.
As Angel is going through all of that, I will just read a couple of these. I love Queer Faculty and Staff Association, more staff members being trained on pronouns and the community in general, and for students to have more events for them aside from one during Pride Month. So important, so important to have that. Creating a dedicated center on campus. Yes, Pride centers do matter. Centers that are, the multicultural centers also really matter because they provide resources to students and faculty and staff too, and administrators. Mental health is so important. Counselors that are LGBTQ plus affirming and come from LGBTQ plus communities, representation does matter. Beyond the physical space for students, programming that teaches staff and faculty how to respect and validate LGBTQ plus identities, hiring more queer professionals, especially of color, human resources department, if there's anyone here, the hiring processes that equal employment opportunity, right? What are we doing for our hiring process to be more inclusive and represent more of our LGBTQ plus communities? Consistent and continued funding. I know that that's an issue for HSI as a whole, and also our LGBTQ plus funding one-time allocation is also something with the Assembly bill that we're going to have a conversation with the Chancellor's office. And it'll take all of you reach out to the Chancellor's office also to ensure that we continue to have these funds. Professional development opportunities. I love this LGBTQ plus curriculum. Workshops on intersectionality and spaces where students feel represented. Collaboration with Pride Center, staff, faculty, student, and other organizations so that gender and sexuality are part of the conversation. We all know that having those conversations can be challenging. So we need to make sure we have a space, right? For that visibility, for that openness, for that privacy also to exist. Students would receive information about the college that is inclusive and welcoming. They would have an opportunity to join an orientation, okay? Celebrating the uniqueness of each student at the college that is unapologetically welcoming to everyone. Yes. Queer literature and research embedded in our curriculum. Yes. See, this is the role of faculty. This is why your role matters. And for those of you that are also in research, those of you that are also graduate students, this is really important work. We can't do this alone. Those of us that are in the field doing it, there's definitely a need. And we need more of this.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. I'm gonna, please continue to put your answers because you all can also, right, it's a collective sharing effort. So you all can see other, what other folks are putting, and that you might be like, oh, I want to bring that to my institution. And why we wanted to do this activity is we're going to have, right, the pushing out, like, okay, we have this money and this is how we're going to use it. This is the time to be unapologetic about what is it that we need, right? With everything that's going on across the nation, as we talked about in the beginning of the session, it's really important for you all to voice what is it that you need that would support your students at your campus. Right. So we know what the literature says, right? We talked about it briefly around community college demographics and Hispanic serving institution emergence is particularly in California. Yet the lack of LGBTQ visibility and services with only no more than 10 or 12 centers. And again, what does even a center mean without structural support? And then expanding, right, our understandingness of those who serve in these roles to better implement the policies in a way that account for that queer and trans identity at the intersections of racial and ethnic identity, right? Because there's a very great opportunity around given all these different buckets of monies and policies that where you can align it in a way that, well, y'all said we got to do this, so I don't know where you're coming from me, because the Vision for Success, the Student Equity Achievement Plan, the LGBTQ monies, the HSI serving, right? Like, so you have a really great opportunity to think about yourselves as policy actors to leverage this work. To communicate with the stakeholders, and Yolanda mentioned it, US students are stakeholders. So as you're telling us here in this Padlet, what is it that you want? Do the same at your institution. Work with student government, work with student clubs and orgs, work with your advisors. And on the flip side, right, for the leaders and folks who work at the campuses, take that initiative to go to the students and ask, right? Take that initiative because as we know in the comments, some people are like, oh, our students funded this resource center or not. Resource centers or affinity-based centers have historically always been founded by students and fought by students. That means the emotional labor and the burden always lies on the students to create existence for themselves in these spaces. So it's time for us to also step out and be like, okay, I can no longer say, well, it's not part of my job purview, whatever. No, the mandates are there. There's an opportunity for us to think about how do we leverage these resources in congruent with one another. And some of the strategies to do so are the ones you named, right? Professional learning opportunities, embedding in curriculum, hiring the right folks who mirror these identities, who understand and have a knowledge base of this work in a way that contributes to improving campus climate for the students that we serve. And then how does that manifest then to what are the services that are missing, and how do we then move towards services? Within this realm of services and what's happening in the nation, right, across legislative mandates, community partnerships are a big part now, because some community colleges are not positioned in a way where they might have that resource center, but there might be a community center nearby in their local community where they partner and they depend on to get those queer and trans services, right? So for example, I sit on a board of an LGBTQ organization, and so does Yolanda, and those are really important in order to think about what you do also externally communicates to how it's impacted for the students internally at our institution. So Yolanda will talk a little bit more of a way that can be done.
Thank you so much, Angel. And now the role of partnerships and relationships. So in addition to our roles in colleges within our districts, we also know the importance of having other stakeholders, which include our council. And so here we have Mr. Mayor Tomas Oliva that is going to be speaking to us a little bit about his role in the Imperial County and a little bit about his participation in being more inclusive for increasing awareness and visibility for our LGBTQ plus communities within the Imperial County. Honorable Oliva.
How goes it? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak a little bit about just the journey. So as mentioned, my name is Tomas Oliva. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I have been serving as the mayor since December of 2021. So I'm a recent mayor. This is the first time I serve as mayor in my city. We rotate, so we all get to serve 1 year. This is my first term on council. I'm the youngest mayor in my county. When I was elected, I was the youngest elected official in my county at the time. And my journey, what I'll share is my relationship with the LGBTQ community started when I was in college. So Imperial County is a very socially conservative area. I remember door knocking on behalf of my friends who were running for state assembly and state senate. And there are some pockets of communities here where I would knock and try to begin to pitch my friends, and they'd say, where do they stand on gay rights or gay marriage, or where do they stand on abortion? Because we vote the way God tells us here, right? And, it was a struggle. I've had a lot of doors slammed in my face because I look Latino, and they assumed that I was there to sell them something. And so I love my community. There are some great people here, but there are also some very naive people and some people that have closed themselves off. And so I was brought up from that community. When I went to college, I met some great people. I was challenged. My mind was, I had a very dear friend. Her name was Melanie Natividad. Melanie was a Filipino female from Chula Vista in South San Diego. And she was the first person that I had encountered up until that point who came out as being lesbian to me. And I remember we sat in Price Center at UC San Diego where we went to school. She was very nervous. She had been going around to each person in the circle of our friends, and she just kind of said, I'm gay. And she just paused, and I could see the fear in her face, and she just said, what do you think? I'm not sure if she felt scared because of where I come from and the community that I represent. She felt that I would ostracize her. And I just said, okay. Right. And I said, you're still the same person that you were 5 minutes ago. You still were the same person that I became friends with. Like, this doesn't change. If anything, this just lets me know you more, right? You've allowed me to know you more of who you are. And we became very great friends, very, very great friends. And the reason why I bring her up is because I used to be a math major in college and I was struggling. And she also guided me towards what I do now because one day, you know, college, right? Having a few drinks and just venting to her about how I wasn't cutting it in college and in my major. And she says, you know, why don't you try law and society, law 101. I took a class, it was great, you know. And just because of that random suggestion that she had, I actually sat in and I took a constitutional class, and I ended up switching my major to public law. And through that, I became passionate about our Constitution, passionate about lawmaking. I thought I wanted to become a lawyer, but then I decided to make laws myself. that would be better served time. But again, I mentioned Melanie because right before the pandemic, I got the call. She had taken her own life because she was struggling with her identity. She was contemplating a transition, physical appearance to seem more masculine. And that was the reunion for those of us that were friends in college. That was the reunion that we dreaded, was to see each other again, to say goodbye to her in her funeral. And so those are impacts that I have had, right? I'm not a member of the LGBTQ community. However, I know that my role is to be the strongest ally that I can be, as because of people who have touched my life greatly, who have set me in the path that I am in, and who have allowed me to understand a walk of life that I may not have walked myself. And now that I represent an entire city, I certainly could imagine that whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's ethnic identity, culture, language, sexual orientation, or anything, I want to make sure that everyone has the space that they deserve to exist, to live, to be happy. And so my challenge here in my community is to take my privilege and to take my authority and to challenge those to think outside the box. And so I have been one of the strongest allies to the LGBTQ Resource Center here in Imperial Valley. I donate. I probably am the only one that actually shows up to their events. I think I'm one of the only elected officials that'll show up to their events because I think a lot of people here are scared. And they're scared of what people will say if they associate themselves with the LGBTQ community. And that small-mindedness is what's keeping us back because we're all part of this community, regardless of anything. I mean, you're part of the community, whether they accept it or not, or whether they're willing to see it or not. And so I just want to serve my role while I get the opportunity to make sure that I'm putting my best foot forward and making sure that policies reflect our community, our true community, in every single person. And so with that, I do not pretend to know everything. And so a lot of the ideologies, philosophies, and a lot of the processes and the conversations that you're all having right now, I really like, by the way, Angel, that triangle that you had shown, because we teach that in political science. It's called, in political science, we call it the iron triangle. And the iron triangle is the lawmakers, the advocates, and then the bureaucrats. Basically, all 3 points have to come together in order to make a solid policy, right? You want to make sure that politicians are allocating the monies, they're setting the policy, they're in consultation with the advocates, because the advocates will know, right? They have their pulse to the ground, and they know exactly what the community would like to see. And then you have bureaucrats or the administration that could tell you what they need in order to execute it or to enforce the policy. And so those 3 points are extremely important. So I want to play my role as best I can while I can. And so I look to you all to to engage with folks like me and to challenge us and to educate us and to inform us as to what we need to do. To either
Yolanda?
Yolanda or Angel.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I can't see. Hi, thank you so much, Mayor Oliva, for joining us today. I'll send it over now to Angel, because I know we have a couple of minutes, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so sorry. I thought I had him pinned on the screen and spotlighting Mayor Tomas. I apologize. But we wanted to have him talk, right? Because of, you know, we know that our community colleges are not created all the same and they're not exist in the same geopolitical area, right? Even though it's the state of California, our rural community colleges have very different experiences and challenges than those in proximity to perhaps more diverse communities in urban settings. So we thought that it would be important to talk about like that partnership, right? How with the LGBT Center, you know, legislature, like how that manifests into moving the needle towards to improving the conditions, experiences, and outcomes for our queer and trans individuals in our campuses, right? And all of these are things that are going to be strategies required to sustain these efforts, right? Because again, this money is going to be there, but it's not going to last forever. So I think it's important for us to think about the different ways in which we hook, right, this work. So when, you know, people try to come for it, it's harder to dismantle because we've been so ingrained in every fabric of the institution and of the community. Some of the resources we wanted to highlight here were obviously the summit. I always give a shout out to the organizers, our folk on the field, our scholar practitioners, leaders doing this work. Because I mean, this is only the 4th summit, right? Which means, again, this is probably really incongruent in alignment with the time we started collecting that CCE non-binary data to the development of this summit, right? If we think about timelines. So we're talking about this is work that's just starting, but it's so needed and has been needed. So throughout this conference, throughout the summit, you'll be able to engage with different folks doing different presentations, and those themselves are strategies to leverage and connect to those pots of monies and that analysis we gave you as a way to align efforts and push them forward to better support queer and trans people of color at your institutions. In addition, Yolanda and I have published around this work. So one of the articles we highlight is this one from the Alliance of Hispanic Serving Institution Educators, examining servingness at California Community College HSIs for LGBTQ Latinx students. And what we do is we have a quick tool we made of how do we audit, how do we do a discourse analysis of what do our websites say, how does that translate to how many times LGBTQ students were mentioned, queer and trans Latinx students were mentioned in certain spaces, and really kind of mapping out, right? Are we even existing in the words, in the narratives of our websites, our materials, of our resources? Because if we're not even written, then what does that mean to the actual manifestation of resources and the materialization of resources? So that was one article that we have, and again, we have others, but that's a tool, right? Like, how do we do this? Again, it could be just looking and scanning your institution and then bringing, hey, across all these public available documents, nothing spoke about this. Yet again, there's this call from the Vision for Success. There's this call from Guided Pathways. There's this call from student equity programs, and now the LGBTQ funds and HSI serving this. And none of this is manifested in the actual language written, right? So those are ways for and strategies to leverage the policy in a way that advances this work. And then I also wrote a quick brief within the American Council on Education, which is one of the big 6 associations in higher ed that leads some policy level work. I wrote a block around how to improve hiring practices for LGBTQ professionals at community colleges. And I pull from other sectors of healthcare to see what are they doing and how can we mirror some of those pieces to increase the number of leaders, right, who have these intersecting identities, who can understand then how to apply these policies and implement them through an intersectional lens to advance this work. Again, you also all have the answers through those like Padlet. I was seeing, I think everybody was super excited about the Padlet, and I'm super excited about the Padlet. So please continue to see it and access it. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact Yolanda and I And thank you again so much for being here and sharing space and listening to us chismear about monies and policy and the work that we need to do to support our students. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez and Yolanda, for sharing. We have a few minutes. We have about 5 minutes for questions. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but you are free to unmute yourself if you have a question. I'll give about, oh, yeah, go ahead.
Good morning, Lisa Solomon, Imperial Valley College. Hello, Yolanda. How can we incorporate some of these ideas in with programs like OFAR, the Open for Anti-Racism? Since we're talking about serving students in largely Hispanic serving institutions like IVC, how can we coordinate these different programs from the Chancellor's office to make everything, especially the curriculum, more inclusive? How can we incorporate OFAR's impact on curriculum with what we want to do and some of the suggestions here for our LGBTQ plus students?
I'll just chime in real quick. Hi, Lisa. It's so happy to have you here. I think when it comes to some of these curriculums, right, we don't exist in a monolith, right? Like we are, the intersection of identities is really important. And so even the use of pronouns, for example, what does that look like to incorporate in the curriculum, for example, and stating what could that do to, increase the efforts, to be more inclusive? Because again, Latinos, Latinxes, right, don't exist just within that group. They also exist within other identities. And I think that's probably a way that we could incorporate some of this. And it was actually one of the suggestions that we had in the Padlet. The other thing too, I think it's looking at how these identities, these funding sources also in terms of curriculum, looking at the syllabus, for example, right? How do we incorporate a syllabi that is more inclusive of identities, resources, programming, and support, right? Asking those critical questions of how do we engage in these difficult conversations? What does a safe place, what does the hiring look like? So embed all of that in the curriculum to have more of that, yes, racialized lens, but also bringing in, again, that intersection of identity. It doesn't mean that it's going to be an easy conversation with your constituents and all of your stakeholders, but I also want to note that this is difficult work, right? I also want to take a step back that when it comes to having the, conversations between administrators, faculty, and staff, there's got to be a lot of, respect, support, and rapport that has to exist. I want you all, especially those that are working within the community colleges, to think about the allies, right? And think about the work we that are self-identified as queer have taken the brunt, right, of taking the leadership in this. People of color in particular have taken this at the forefront. So all of you that are allies, move the needle forward. We need your voices. We need you all to step it up when it comes to implementation and strategizing. It cannot be that the voices are only at the forefront of people of color, especially with this LGBTQ plus work. It's a lot of us doing the heavy lifting. We're already experiencing heavy liftings of discrimination at our college campuses. So I highly encourage all of you to also speak up, speak in support of these communities, and engage in those conversations as we are engaging at the forefront. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We have some questions. I know we have a quick hands, and and in the chat we have questions around how do we even talk about this if we're not invited to the table. I like to present us in a way that we think about ourselves as policy actors, right? Often we used to be scared of engaging with policy, like it just seems this really scary thing. And I think remembering that like we carry out the policy implementation, right? Like when they're asking us to do something, our work is required this, we are interpreting something in a way that it has an actual outcome. So the part around queer theory and critical policy analysis is like, how do we look at that mandate in a way that what doesn't explicitly say this, but it doesn't also explicitly say not this. So how do we leverage it and align it with things? That is where like leveraging policy comes into play, right? Policy scholars have noted how policy sometimes is very intentionally written, very vague, to either move an agenda forward or prohibit an agenda from moving forward. So I think that's like a really unique opportunity to think about departmental policies, institutional policies, district-wide policies that you can use and leverage to be, hey, we got to do this because XYZ says this and it aligns with this and blah, 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 right? And then that way it's not you saying it, it's more like all these things are saying, and I just brought it together to your presentation. I think I have Richard and Alejandro and Lisa. Oh wait, is that Lisa from the past? Right, I'll lower the hand. Okay, so Richard.
Thank you. First, great presentation. My question is, if we're aware that Hispanic is not a cool word and Latinx is, and we use it so much, isn't it maybe part of our conversation to move it forward? I know we have HSIs as our, we can say it's what we go to, but to use it continually when it's not a word that embraces the community puts a question mark. And then to follow that, my second part is the same with using the word queer. The reason we use the word queer is because gay does not represent women. It doesn't represent bisexual. That's why the generation said, let's stop this. Let's call ourselves what we all can recognize. And using the word queer is an umbrella term that's inclusive. So I think it's upon us that words do matter. So whether we listen or we say it, I think saying queer and saying Latinx versus Hispanic, those are small steps that I think can make a big difference.
Oh my gosh, the identity politics, Richard, so thank you for bringing it up, is really difficult. I will say that in some pockets of the nation, using the word Hispanic or Hispano, Hispana, Hispanic, X is very common too. So I think when it comes to identity politics, we're not here to police necessarily how people self-identify. I think the whole point is to be inclusive in terms of like how we want to self-represent, how we want to self-embody, how we want to then partake in the engagement of these conversations. There's a Latin asterisk now that is trying to encompass in the language from a linguistic standpoint. So I think we will continue to engage, and I don't want to just state that at the forefront Latinx. Latinx has gotten a lot of pushback in terms of not being inclusive of trans experiences in particular. So there's so much conversation that has to be had. And I want to also note that Hispanic serving institutions as a policy is just the policy, right? Thinking about the movement back in 1992 and before that, when the leaders of the movement created the policy in order to gain support and funding from the Department of Education. Take a step back and also note that as practitioners in this work, our job is not to police the policy. Our job is how do we move the movement forward within our institution. What sounds right at IVC is not going to sound, the same at Grossmont, San Diego Mesa College, you name it, Fresno City College. It's not going to be the same. However, it is up to us to then interpret what our communities need, what our students need, and then look at the forefront and maybe ask our students, what do you self-identify? Have a survey, have that evidence to state we're going to move forward, have a graduation that adheres to X, Y, and Z because of what they've decided to identify. But that is a robust conversation, Richard. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thank you, Landa. And then our last question from Alejandro as we wrap it up. We want to be mindful of time because we all want to get to other amazing sessions.
Yes, buenos dias, everybody. My name is Alejandro. I'm a student here at University of Santa Cruz, and also I transferred from Los Rios district in Sacramento. And I just want to say this is more or less than a question, but from experience as a student who's didn't realize that they were going to be thrown into the social justice due to their identities. I just want to also say, from personal, don't tokenize students. And also too, we're not the poster child of the whole LGBTQ plus community because it is exhausting. It is sometimes very demeaning, and our identities shouldn't be challenged to the point of questioning our own existence here in the education system. That is not right, and that is not okay. I understand folks want to be allies, but if you're going to be an ally, move out of the way. And if we ask for support, because I've seen it here here in Santa Cruz. I've seen it at my community college because it does get emotionally exhausting. And I want to thank each and every one of you for being here and support. But I just needed to get that out there off my chest.
And this is your space, right? This is the queer and trans space. So yes, this is the moment to say it. Because it's true, right? This is for and with students, ultimately. So thank you so much, Alejandro, for the final words to wrap this up for us. Y muchas gracias, everybody, for having us. And thank you, Yolanda. I always love presenting with you and the work that we do. That's hard work, and it's hard work. So gracias.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Gracias a todos. A few closing remarks before you log off. We appreciate the knowledge our presenters have shared. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez Yolanda, for the time they've given to the summit. As a reminder, session recordings will be posted in the app within 2 weeks after the conference, and chat information will be included. We ask that you complete the session survey listed at the bottom of the session in the conference app at this time. We have a great rest of the day planned for you. We will be moving to a break and then session 2, which starts at 11:45. So drink some water, stretch, walk around, and the links for all those activities can be found in the conference app. Gracias. Thank you again for attending the session, and we'll see you on the internets.
Ciao, everyone. And yes, Monica, fame.
Bye, everyone.